Now I feel the pressure to do something really, really awesome for this talk. So, you know. So, a quick look at Microgames. So, a little bit about myself. That's my website. That's my handle on twitter.com. I'm currently working on Plankyte, a small game about snow and recovery set in a calm mountain village. It's kind of a short 20-ish minute game. And I'm also working on Trash Zine, a zine featuring experimental, unusual game developers in 500-word interviews. So it doesn't really make sense to just throw random microgames at you and go like, you should go play Hot Date because it's about dating pugs. So I'm going to focus on a specific subset, which is personal microgames, and discuss the different uses they have, the aspects of their design, and just go through a bunch of examples in that way. So what do I mean by personal microgames? It's games like Get Up. So the description of this game on the itch.io page is when you can't sleep at night, so you make a game about the morning. And in it, you can only use 4 keys, the arrow keys. And as you click on them, your character starts just moving around in the bed. And you start clicking, you start thinking, okay, is there a pattern? How do I like actually end up like rolling off the bed? How does it work? But that's actually kind of it. Like, you can't actually get out of bed, and that's the whole point of the game. Another game, if you were at a talk earlier today, you might have heard more about this. So another game about the troubles of getting up in the morning, seems like a recurring theme, morning makeup madness. And so you have to use different tools to put makeup onto yourself. But obviously you only have 10 seconds, so you end up making beautiful faces like this. So at first, it seems like the examples I've given are super, super limited. Like, you have just a couple of mechanics, a couple of tools, just a few seconds or minutes to play. So how come people use these kind of short games to talk about personal experiences? Because they don't seem to have much complexity, right? There's just a couple of mechanics here and there. So how are they useful for communicating personal stories? So it's all about combining. So I've been told that these are Duplos, but I call them Lego blocks. I hope that's okay with everyone. So a lot can be achieved by combining a bunch of very simplistic mechanics together, as I will show afterwards, because they become more meaningful than the sum of their parts. And a good example for this, it's, for example, the brain. So the brain is really complex. So you have all these thoughts and everything, but at the end, it's only just neurons, and you have an input, and then the neuron is like, oh, threshold, something, something, and then output. And if you combine a bunch of these neurons together, you get reflexes. You combine more of them, you get thought patterns, and then you get like really complex things. And so you can actually communicate really nuanced things in microgames by combining the right mechanics together. So an example I like is Limb. So in this game, you're a cube, and you walk around in this maze, and you have these other cubes that also walk around. And the idea is that when you start the game, you're told that you can use Z as a button. So, okay, you start walking around. And when you get to one of these rooms, if the color of the square is not the same as yours, they start bullying you. They start pushing you towards the beginning of the maze, like it's just a really unpleasant experience. But if you hold Z, you can actually turn the shade of the squares that you're in the room of. But the problem with that, though, is that as you're holding Z, the screen starts to contract onto you. There's like white noise that starts happening, and you start moving slightly slower, and it's just really uncomfortable as an experience. So as you can see, this game is like visually quite bare. There's moving around as a mechanic and holding one button as a mechanic. But it communicates so much. Like, it's really clear that what kind of themes it is dealing with. And so this idea of trade-off and balancing two things can seem pretty simple, but it's really useful, especially because people will understand this mechanic differently. So some people might start the game and be like, oh, there's Z as a button. Okay, I'm just going to start holding it. And they play the whole game while holding it. Or some others might not even realize that you can press the button and try to actually push through the maze themselves. And some others might experiment to varying degrees with this mechanic. So again, that makes it a bit more personal. Another game that I really, really love, it's called Queers in Love at the End of the World. And basically you are at the end of the world and you're in love and you also happen to be queer. And it's text-based, and you have 4 choices almost at each stage. So when you start a game, you have this that appears, and you notice right away, okay, there's a timer, I need to make decisions quick. So you decide, kiss her, hold her, take her hand, tell her. You're like, okay, hold her, okay, I clicked on that. And then bam, you have 4 more options. And you're like, wait, I only have 10 seconds. And like you continue playing through it, and you have so little time to make the choices. So when you play the game again, at some point you might try to just push through the choices and see where it ends up. Or some other times you might just enjoy reading the text. And like there's this trade-off between enjoying the present moment kind of at the end of the world, or actually taking as many actions as you can and like showing your partner that you love them. And so this is all achieved by just having branching text and a timer, which is just really impressive in my opinion. And in a way, the game just kind of reflects on the endless space of possibility of like, that's what makes us human kind of. And I really love this as an example because it's so bare, but it really communicates how simple mechanics can help for personal experiences. Practice. So to summarize quickly, you cannot really afford to make complex systems, and you cannot afford to have clutter when you're making a very small microgame. So you only have a couple of minutes, just a bit of the player's attention. So you have to focus on the core mechanics. So figuring out a couple of core mechanics that communicate something well is really, really hard, actually. Like, it might seem like the games are really simple, but it takes a lot of time to figure out how to make them. So you can see microgames as a design exercise. Like, constraints in general, as has been mentioned in previous talks, is really good for practice. If we go back to Get Up and we just kind of deconstruct it, the devs' challenge was to communicate the frustration and anxiety of getting up in the morning in as little time, in a little time. And so the problem that they were faced with is that they needed to make sure that they communicate frustration. So how did they do that? First of all, the instructions, they're in the game themselves. There's a dot. Okay, you know that's the only thing you have to do. You have the visuals, you have the bed hair that's all over the place. When you actually press the arrow keys, they make this like annoying white noise. So every single feature of the game, like whether it's visuals, audio, or like text, everything is precisely modeled to fit with the experience they wanted to communicate, which is not being able to get up in the morning. And it's just really interesting to kind of take very small microgames and try to deconstruct them in that way. Cigarettes, I couldn't find a proper screenshot of this, but this game is about having a smoking addiction. And so at the very top of the game, you'd have this bar, and this is like an anxiety meter-ish. So it would start decreasing throughout the game. And when it's really low, your character starts sweating and is really uncomfortable. But you also happen to have a pack of cigarettes on the side. And so if you actually click the pack of cigarettes, your anxiety meter gets better again. But it continues decreasing throughout the game, though. So you click the pack of cigarettes again, and so it increases again. And it just kind of continuously continues. I'm not sure if that's correct, but it does that. And actually, you can win the game if you like stay in the anxiety area for very, very, very long. At some point, like your character just kind of gets over it, their addiction. And so in the actual graphics of the game, all you have is this character in the middle, the pack of cigarettes, and the anxiety bar. And you might think, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, that's the only things you need. But it also really puts the player in a position where they can't avoid what's happening. Like, they cannot focus on other pretty visuals or like escape the gameplay. There's literally, that's all there is. Like, you have that anxiety bar and you see that it's diminishing and you have to like deal with it and you have to do it, and that's your only focus. And you can't figure out an answer at the beginning. And so this frustration, again, is integral to the game, and that's why it works so well. So as to like my own experience, I I have made a ton of these small game things by doing one game a month, so one small experiment every month. And so no matter whether the game was good or bad, I still felt like I learned something. So actually, that's the reason why I put pens and drawing utensils here, is because artists have something similar to one game a month, which is called Inktober. And they make doodles for each day during the month of October. And what's really useful with it is that you understand when you think about art is that doodles are just about practice. And it's not about the results, it's just about, let's say, practicing perspective or practicing proportions. And you can apply this to games too. So I hope that, like, none of these are, like, embarrassing, because I just, like, sometimes I make really weird games, so... Yeah. Sometimes when I'm making some of these games, I realize that because of the fact that I've made so many small things, I become just better at switching into like a game design mode. And I think Jenny mentioned that too with all her prototypes. It's the fact that you kind of develop this kind of theory of how you work better and how you are able to iterate better. And because of that, that means that when it comes to game jams, sometimes you hear those like horror stories where people really like overscope their project or they really did something wrong. But when you really get into this mindset of making small things over and over, you just kind of get used to most of the problems that you can encounter, and that's really, really useful. And another thing that I will mention later is how translating feelings into mechanics can be useful for communication. That's coming a bit later. However, the first thing I want to mention is the process of choosing the couple of core mechanics for your game. This isn't just like a design exercise, but it can have cathartic uses. So catharsis. As Lindsay mentioned before, people might paint or exercise or do something else to release tension or to kind of have this creative output. And the benefit with games is that obviously you can do it too. It's a medium just like any other. You can just throw things into a prototyping engine quickly one evening when you're really feeling down and have this long development session where you're just making things and you're completely focused and you just end up with like a finished thing at the end that really reflects your state of mind. And it's really rewarding, and ultimately it might just help you kind of let go by having this like one thing that completely encompasses your whole experience, and you only spend like a few hours making it, but you have something finished, and like there's this feeling of closure, at least for me, and you feel better. Like if you think about cigarettes, the description of this game is I've picked up a bad habit. So it's definitely a personal game. Like the avatar you see is the actual creator of the game, and they made it as a way to process like their addiction. Like it's not that they didn't know what they should do to like get over smoking. It's just the representation of this mechanic of just the anxiety bar and then like deciding to smoke because that's the only like kind of option you see, and like it just made sense for them. And again, Get Up is about like spending a whole night being like, oh my God, I literally can't fall asleep, and just I'm gonna do something productive out of this, like get some good out of a bad experience and make a game about it. And this game, as I imagine it, the developer just kind of wanted to kind of externalize their experience, make it into like something else, like put all the negative feelings, bubble them up into a game. And it doesn't have to be about sad stuff. A self-care jam took place a few months ago, I think. This is a screenshot from an article on Killscream. So games about self-care are really important, and they can help you. Well, basically, there are games that are about positive experiences. There are games about healing and focusing on the positive thought loops. So again, when you're developing, instead of kind of cathartically thinking about, okay, there's all these negative things, I'm going to think about them and then make them into a game and then forget about them. In this case, you're taking positive things and kind of thinking about the mechanics surrounding them and how you can represent positive things. So you're just kind of not really tricking, but more like training your brain to like encounter positive thought loops and really integrate them. And that's kind of the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. Though I don't want to talk about that too much. There's an article called CBTs for Hackers that kind of explains how CBT has to do with mechanics and kind of figuring things out and how it really fits with the hacker mindset. So games in the self-care jam were made about taking care of yourself when you get up in the morning, so the positive side, and self-care bots. And this is a screenshot from Losing Control. And what I liked about the kill screen interview is that the developer wrote, I wanted to create this game as a reminder to myself that feeling bad isn't necessarily a bad thing, that those feelings have importance and that they aren't permanent. So the important part for me in this sentence is that the developer said the game is a reminder. So it doesn't serve just the function of being a game and like a cathartic kind of experience, but it has this kind of reminding property. And the reminding property, I managed to link those two slides well. I'm happy about that. So snapshots, Microgames and snapshots. So this particularly works well if you're doing something quite regular, like one game a month. So because I was doing one game a month, I was able to kind of get these snapshots of my life of like every single month that I developed a game. So usually my process is that I would have a very short development cycle. So I would spend a couple of days or just a few hours in an afternoon making a small game. So that meant that I could remember very well the environment I was in when I was making the game, because it didn't really change at all. Like I was just like in my room in a certain location doing a game for a few hours. And that meant that when I actually play these games, like these ones, if I take just any one of them, I can usually recall like what I was doing around that time, to what people I was talking around that time. And that's really interesting, because that means that the game has this like reminding property in that I'm able to, like, a bit like looking at a picture, but at the same time it's like interactive, and I'm able to recall why I made the different design decisions, and sometimes different aspects of the game are influenced by different things, and this makes them into like this different log of your life, this interactive aspect that is added to them. And an example of that is the game Where the Punk's At. So it is about being a punk and kicking trash cans and going to a punk show. And this was just like this big inside joke with a friend. And when I play this, like it's really not a good game. But when I play it, I'm really happy, because I remember of how I felt when I was making it, because I was just chatting with a friend, and then I went, actually, yeah, like I can make a game about this. Like I have the tools, I have the skills, I can just make a thing. And every time I play it, I am reminded of how I felt when I first started making games, and when I felt this kind of endless space of possibility. And now, obviously, now reality has hit me and everything. But like, it's just good to go back. So it's interesting because, again, as with other art forms, this is not that much different. Like, you're able to do that with any art form where you look at something and you have a different perspective because of the time span between making it and playing it. But you are enhanced by the fact that it's interactive. Like, you're not just a viewer of the other kind of creation, but you're able to actually interact with it, and you're kind of playing with what you made in the past. So you, in two instances in time, it's kind of meta. But it's, again, it's like writing a diary, again, with the snapshots. It's like writing a diary and being able to flick back and kind of remember, but it's more fun because it's games. So that brings me to Microgames as communication. So communication. Sometimes it's hard to talk to people, and it's hard to say things in words. So if you have made a bunch of microgames, because you followed all the previous advice, you have the skills to translate feelings and experiences into mechanics. And also, you're good at scoping games, because you know that you can just spend a few hours here or there, and you can afford to spend a few hours here and there because it's just nothing, right? It's just a couple of hours. And that means that you can actually, instead of talking to someone or writing a song or painting a painting to tell them something, you can actually make a very specific game for a very specific person, so that you can serve the use of being like a tool of communication. So games can be used as this kind of intermediary, and it's kind of interesting how, for example, in my case, I feel like it's not really me that's doing the thing, so I'm able to be a bit more honest in that, for example, if the player is playing the game, I can put in more honest content in it, because it's not really me that's saying them to do things. It's more like they're interacting with the game that is like an external thing, and the game is reacting to them. So that means that you're able to kind of put in content that you wouldn't normally put into words when you're trying to communicate with that person. So this specific games for specific people is something I'm really interested in, and I made this game called Trust. So it's like a paper-based game. And I didn't realize that this. Everyone can read my like shit poetry from when I was like 16. But anyway, the idea was that you had these envelopes, and the person playing the game would just open the envelopes, and it would have screenshots of conversations of I had when I was smaller. They'd have poetry I wrote. They'd have like just lots of random content personally related to my life. And the idea was that this person that I made this game for hadn't known me at that time, so it was a way for me to be like, hello person, I want you to know more about me, have a game. That was the idea. And a game like Robin kind of also serves a similar purpose. So it is about chronic fatigue syndrome, and the idea that when you're disabled, you're unable to have enough energy during the day to do everything, so you kind of have to have this meter of energy, and also only do the things that are really essential. And depending on the days, you might not have enough energy. And this works very well when it comes to mechanics. And obviously, this means that someone who's playing it is able to better understand. And so again, losing control seems pretty obvious. That again, it's about communicating depression and the dynamics of depression. So instead of completely just stating it to someone else, you can just do it through a game. So this brings me to microgames as self-care. So going through the process of just thinking differently about an experience, thinking in terms of mechanics, like looking at things through a game design lens, that's really useful, because you're able to just kind of process the experience, and you're able to deconstruct it. You can give it to someone else and kind of see how they react and communicate and empathize. So it's really, really cool. I wanted to mention this game of mine, it's called Yearly, and the idea is that you have these 3 characters and you have that clock, and you can talk to the characters, but each time you talk to them, the clock advances by 1 hour, and the idea is that you're talking to your high school friends, and when the night ends, you just have to leave because you have to leave. And good explanation there, Vaida, good job. And you just have to leave for the next year of uni or whatever, and you can never finish the conversations with everyone because of this clock. And so you come back every year, and every year like the actual wall kind of crumbles more and people change more. And as I was designing this game, at first I was like, okay, yeah, I get what it is about. I know what I'm doing here. I've made a bunch of these, I know what I'm doing. And so I was making it, and then I realized that the clock actually had way more importance than I thought. And like even when the walls completely crumble, the clock is still there, hanging, like kind of in a kind of magical realism thing. And I realized as I was finishing this game that I was not really trying to communicate the anxiety of talking to people, or the fact that like just like anything related to the people themselves, but my real problem was the idea of like time passing in itself. So that was interesting for me to realize. And I think something funny about making micro games too is that when you're trying to tweet them out to people, sometimes you realize that you have to, well, obviously describe the game, but the initial idea that you had for that game shifted, and the game became about something else. Because as you were processing these kind of like mechanics and everything, you started off from a place of anxiety, but then you kind of were able to unfurl the problem, and you didn't realize that it molded itself into kind of something else because of the fact that it was in terms of mechanics rather than in terms of like feelings. So there's this kind of two-way path. And one of the final things I'll mention is As I Listen to Rain. So it has excerpts of poems, and it invites the player to contemplate with the developer on like what these poems mean. So in this case, there's a double purpose in that the developer is like, oh, I want to kind of understand myself better through the poetry I wrote in the past. But the player is also in a similar situation in that they have not read these poems before. So they're also discovering them for the first time and need to understand them. So you're both, you and the developer, sitting next to each other, reading these poems. So this creates kind of more of a human kind of contact, and you're both kind of processing and trying to piece things together. And the final point is Microgames is allowing yourself to make weird stuff and not feeling bad about wasting time, because it is so freeing to make just weird games for a couple of hours from time to time. Like you can spare a few hours usually, and you might feel better. You might be able to help other people. You might be able to process your own experiences. And the very, very final game I will mention is Magic Squat House. So it had some influence on my work, because it's actually about being a punk and running away from your parents and forming a punk band. And you can have like slime people that you can get for your band, and then you can actually play using the arrow keys, and it's like really weird. And my point with this slide was you could have made Magic Squat House. It's a really cool thing, and like it's so interesting to see also more people from non-game fields experimenting with games as a medium, and this kind of thing is just so pleasant to see, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of it. And to finish off, a tweet by Robert Yang, and it says, what if people made games about these fantasies? Enjoying company of others, people being glad to see you, being proud of someone else. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, I'm always limiting myself to just a few mechanics, so am I not afraid that I'm not exploring enough, kind of, because of that I'm just being too limited? Yeah. Okay, so the idea is that I cannot reach a certain level of skill/complexity because of the fact that I really kind of cap what I explore, kind of. Yeah. Well, I'm not repeating because I don't understand. I'm repeating for the recording, actually. So, but yeah. I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, again, that kind of puts me back to Jenny's talk, where she mentioned that it's important to just kind of be aware of the positives and the negatives. So obviously, like, I'm not saying that this will be all I make for the rest of my life, but like, yeah, that would be a shitload of games. But it's just I don't feel the pressure right now to make something that's more complex, because I feel the need to really explore many different parts to just kind of get a gist of what they are about. So I do feel like there's a problem with the fact that obviously I cannot explore too complex mechanics, but there's also a kind of trade-off where I can actually just make a bunch of tiny games that build onto each other that could kind of maybe mimic that complexity, in that it's not like a kind of that kind of evolution, but that kind of evolution. I think that's vertical and that's horizontal. I think, yeah. Hopefully that kind of answered your question. Cool. Yes. Oh. Yeah. So I don't. Yeah. That's a very good question. So the idea of feedback loops in the personal games, what kind of platforms can be used, and how the platforms will evolve. Yeah, that's a tricky one with personal games, because obviously you're making something about your experience, and like sometimes people criticizing it is a bit weird. But I think it really depends on the people. Like some people are fine with making personal games and kind of iterating on them. So obviously something like forums and Twitter would be really useful. But how I do it usually is that I have a list of like 5 people that are like quite games knowledgeable, but they're also kind of non-gamers enough that I can test it well on them. And I just, every time I make a new game, I just send all the people that kind of version of the game, and I just kind of iterate. But I do have the problem that I don't iterate enough usually, because I just kind of make a game in a few hours and then I just want to be done with it, which is kind of negative of how I approach things, is that I can be very prolific, but I don't usually get the benefits of that feedback loop. Yeah. Was there a question on that side, or?
Regular little series of things you do when you're going to make a new game, or do you just try to mess with different stuff?
No, so what kind of software and tools do I use, and do I have like a specific process of going through them? Yes, I do. I don't usually dabble in things because the dabbling in things already takes a lot of time. I use Construct 2 because it's very quick for prototyping. I use Twine if it's a text-based game. For audio, I use Ableton Live 9 because since it's a more like DJing kind of audio software, it's made to be easy for editing and so on. I use BFXR for sound effects, which is an online tool that's really kind of easy to use, and Photoshop or Illustrator because I'm just knowledgeable in Adobe tools. So it's, I feel like, for example, Illustrator has like a high learning curve, but it's just about the tools that you are comfortable with. So like you wouldn't think Illustrator is useful for like making some types of games that I'm making, like those kind of more trashy aesthetic games, but it's really just about your own comfort, I guess. Do you have time for maybe one? I don't know. No. Okay. Good. Okay. Cool. Sorry. You can talk to me later, maybe, or are we? Or wait, did I misunderstand? What's happening?
No, we're not.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, thank you for coming.